And if you've watched the recent couple of episodes that I've done, I've basically done kind of a series on Alexander Hamilton's views, his plans of government, which were all pretty much awful. And on this episode, I want to kind of go to the other end of the spectrum of the series from Hamilton and look at Thomas Jefferson. And I think there's maybe no better way to show the difference in their views than this story that Thomas Jefferson shared in a letter to Benjamin Rush in 1811 about a dinner party that Jefferson hosted on the recommendation or request of George Washington. I think it was in 1791. And here's how Jefferson described it. He said, "The room being hung around with a collection of the portraits of remarkable men. Among them were those of Bacon, Newton, and Locke. Hamilton asked me who they were. I told him they were my trinity of the three greatest men the world had ever produced, naming them again." We're talking about Bacon, Newton, and Locke. And on the other end of the spectrum, we have Alexander Hamilton. He said, he paused for some time. "The greatest man," said he, "that ever lived was Julius Caesar." So on the one hand, you've got Bacon, Newton, and Locke, who I'm going to talk about here a little bit today. Quick overview on each. On the other end of the spectrum, you have a totalitarian dictator. So that's who Hamilton was motivated by, the latter, and Jefferson, of course, the former. And I thought it was pretty cool because over at Jefferson's Monticello today, you can actually see a picture. I've got a link to it here, which I'll include in the show notes, of those three pictures hanging out in that parlor still to this very day. I'm not sure if it's open to the public to take a look at or not, but I will link to that in the show notes so you can check that out. So again, the Jefferson writes to Benjamin Rush describing this, and these are the paintings in the parlor. And it tells us really that these three men, because he's talking about them as being his trinity of the greatest, that Jefferson was really a man of the Enlightenment. And if we want to understand what that is, I'm not going to get into a lot of detail. I am not an expert on it, but here's a quick overview. The Age of the Enlightenment, or the Enlightenment, also known as the Age of Reason, was an intellectual and philosophical movement that occurred in Europe, especially Western Europe, in the 17th and 18th centuries, with global influences and effects. It included a range of ideas centered on the value of human happiness, the pursuit of knowledge obtained by means of reason and the evidence of the senses, and ideals such as natural law, liberty, progress, toleration, fraternity, constitutional government, and separation of church and state. Now, I've seen some people sum this up, and they would probably know better than I do. Three main principles included things like individualism, reason, and skepticism. Of course, it's all grounded in things like natural law and liberty. So let's look at that first one that Jefferson talked about in his Trinity, and that's Sir Francis Bacon, who was a mid-16th to early 17th century guy. He was an English philosopher and statesman who served as Attorney General and Lord Chancellor of England under King James I. Bacon led the advancement of both natural philosophy and the scientific method. I think he's often called the father of empiricism, but he also played a leading role in establishing the British colonies in North America. And I think this may be the tie-in for Jefferson, especially in Virginia, the Carolinas, and Newfoundland. His government report on the Virginia colony was submitted in 1609, and there are some scholars, I can't verify one way or the other, but there are some scholars who believe he was largely responsible for the drafting in 1609 and 1612 of two charters of government for the Virginia colony. William Hepworth Dixon, this is over in Wikipedia, considered that Bacon's name could be included in the list of the founders of the United States, maybe a grandfather or a great-grandfather. Now, Benjamin Franklin was a big fan as well, and here he is in his Poor Richard's Almanac. Poor Richard, improved in 1749. Put it this way, on the 7th of this month, 1626, died that great little man, Sir Francis Bacon, great in his prodigious genius, parts, and learning, and little in his servile compliances with a little court and submissive flattery of a little prince. I mean, not total fan. Pope characterizes him thus in one strong line. If parts allure thee, think how Bacon shined, the wisest, brightest, meanest of mankind. And one way that we can see some of Bacon's influence throughout Jefferson's writing, especially in later years, was the phrase, knowledge is power. And that's often attributed, as Monticello puts it here, to Francis Bacon from his Meditations Sacrae, 1597. And they point out that Jefferson used this phrase in his correspondence on at least 4 occasions. each time in connection with the establishment of a university in Virginia, which is what he thought was one of his most important projects. So here's a couple of examples. I've got two of them. One in a letter to George Tinkner in 1817. He says, knowledge is power, knowledge is safety, and knowledge is happiness. Benjamin Rush, some years later, earlier than this letter here, also said, without knowledge, without learning, people are incapable of knowing your rights. And if you can't know your rights, you don't know how to defend them. Without knowledge, you have no power. And Jefferson basically equated knowledge with power, safety, and happiness. And here he is again to a letter to Joseph C. Cabell, Christmas Day. This is what Jefferson is writing about, December 25th, 1820. He said, there are but 3 states smaller than Massachusetts, that she is the 21st only in the scale of size, and but 1/10 of that of Virginia. Yet it is unquestionable that she has more influence in our confederacy than any other state in it. I like that he still refers to it as a confederacy. Whence this ascendancy? From her attention to education unquestionably. And he said there can be no stronger proof that knowledge is power and that ignorance is weakness. And we see this all over today. There's so much ignorance on the founding principles, on the Constitution, on what liberty is all about, and how to defend all of them. That's basically the work that we do. We try to teach these original foundational principles, and of course, how to defend the Constitution and liberty when government refuses to do so, which is constant 24/7, 365. And a vast majority the vast majority of the people are nowhere close to having knowledge. And therefore, the people are weak and the government is extremely, extremely strong. So Jefferson is talking about that as well. Now, St. George Tucker also mentioned Bacon, the great Bacon. Everything goes better with Bacon, right? The great Bacon observes, and this is in his view of the Constitution of the United States, 1803, that as exception strengthens the force of a law, in cases not accepted, so enumeration weakens it, in cases not enumerated. And so he goes on, the powers, and this is kind of a 10th Amendment foundational argument, the powers vested in Congress, the privileges of the members and of each house are severally enumerated in the Constitution, not made exceptions from general powers, not enumerated. So Tucker also cited him. And if you want to learn more, and again, this is just a very brief introduction, I thought knowledge is power was a very important part because, as Jefferson said in another letter, he said, if a nation expects to be ignorant and free in a state of civilization, it expects what never was and never will be. So incumbent upon us, if we believe in natural law, natural rights, and liberty, to actually become as aware of it as possible and help educate others, because that's the only way we're going to be free is if the 99.9% of the people that surround us who hate liberty probably today don't anymore. So we've got a lot of work to do. And so Liberty Fund has a really interesting overview of Francis Bacon from a couple of years ago that will be linked to in the show notes. I keep mentioning that 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. Alan Mosley does all the organizing and he sets up the blog post with all the links, and I get it published a couple hours after the live stream is done. So you will see that over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty today. That's where we have all the episodes. You can find all the different platforms we're on. And of course, when you're wondering, hey, Bolden, where's that link to that episode, that article you were talking about, that letter from Jefferson, you'll find it all there as well. I'm going to skip over the live chat probably a little bit today because I'm running a little behind with some technical difficulties at the beginning of the show, but let's get right back to it. So we've covered Bacon. Let's look a little bit. We can never cover Bacon enough. I can't stop saying that, but let's look a little bit at Sir Isaac Newton, not someone you'd think of as having an influence on the founding generation, on the structure of the Constitution even, but there really is an interesting point to be made here from an article by Rob Natelson, The Ideas That Form the Constitution, Sir Isaac Newton, a really great series that he did on this, on some of the people who influenced the founders. And Joe Wolverton does awesome work on this as well. And Rob writes this, Sir Isaac Newton wasn't a political thinker like Marcus Cicero or John Locke, who we'll get to in a moment. He was a scientist. Indeed, he exemplified the scientific revolution, an event that changed not only how people thought about the physical universe, but also how they thought about politics in government. In that way, Newton and his scientific colleagues greatly affected the U.S. Constitution. I would rather call it the Constitution for the United States. Again, Rob says the scientific revolution, and particularly Newton's work, taught men that the universe wasn't willful or chaotic, but governed by rules of order. Once you knew the rules, the physical universe becomes predictable. So, for example, if you know that if you vest the power of both declaring and waging war in one individual, that person will become very prone to waging the war or declaring the war in order to wage it. And that's what many of the founders said as well. If you give too much power to too few people, you shouldn't be surprised that power expands, because it is a maxim of human nature that when you give power to anyone, whether it's vested in many or in a few, as Abigail Adams put it, it is ever grasping. So these are the types of things that we learn. And if you think about that first law of motion from Sir Isaac Newton, I know we probably all heard about something like this in science class many years ago, and I don't have this exact, but it's basically an object at rest tends to stay at rest, and an object in motion tends to stay in motion unless it's acted on by some external force. And so if you think about it in that context, a government that is always expanding, unless there is a counterbalancing force, it will relentlessly expand. And that's what really we've seen play out, because there has been almost no counterbalancing force in modern times. And so this government that starts to grow bit by bit for one emergency or another, for one extreme situation, you get a Federal Reserve and an income tax or the Patriot Act, these things that are supposed to be limited to very small things. And then they expand over time and they get worse and worse and worse. And unless states and people act as a counterbalance to the government, Lysander Spooner said resistance is really the only way to keep a government in check. And that's the same thing that one of the first associate justices on the Supreme Court said, James Iredell. The inherent right of the people to prevent usurpation's exercise is the only way to stop that. That's how James Iredell put it. So if you think of it in that context, the idea of the 10th Amendment, the idea of nullification is very Newtonian. It's about acting, an external object acting against that federal government. Anyways, that's my side rant on that. Back to Rob's article. The early days of the convention were dominated. So if you think also about the structure of the Constitution as well, there's also a discussion on this going on in Philadelphia in 1787. And he says the early days of the convention were dominated by arguments for a powerful national government that would relegate the states to wholly subordinate roles. James Wilson and James Madison were among those making such arguments. And then once you get to the midpoint, I went through Alexander Hamilton's plan of government. Madison's was the Virginia plan was an insane big government plan. It was really, really bad. And Hamilton's made Madison's look like small government in comparison. But anyways, Madison also favored a small aristocratic Senate. He claimed that a larger Senate would have insufficient influence. He compared the case to that of the tribunes in the Roman Republic. When their number was increased, Madison said they lost their influence. Now, anyways, on June 7th, 1787, John Dickinson, the penman of the American Revolution, the lead drafter of the Articles of Confederation, he was also a Federalist when it came to ratification of the Constitution, but he did not like the idea of a totally centralized government. Of course, he's the guy who wrote the Articles or did a lot of the work on the Articles. And so according to James Madison's own notes, here's what Dickinson said in response to these proposals from people like Wilson and Madison to basically treat the states as just a subordinate of the central government or as a mere corporation. Because Madison wanted a total veto power over the states, which wasn't much different than the Hamiltonian version, which was worse. But anyways, Dickinson put it this way: the preservation of the states in a certain degree of agency is indispensable. It will produce that collision between the different authorities which should be wished for in order to check each other. Very, very Newtonian. To attempt to abolish the states altogether would degrade the councils of our country, would be impracticable, would be ruinous. He compared, now if you think about what Dickinson's saying, now he didn't want the states to be completely independent either. He wasn't looking for what he helped create under the Articles. He wanted to see more energy in the government. But if you look at what Hamilton had to offer, he basically was saying, I want to get rid of the states completely. The only reason we can't propose that is because the public at large will have a hissy fit. So otherwise, he was totally down to do that. And then he worked for a number of years after ratification, do what he could to try to make that play out in practice. So anyways, back to Dickinson. He compared the proposed national system to the solar system, in which the states were the planets and ought to be left to move freely in their proper orbits. So a combination of science, about balance, about checking something that's in motion, an external force against the central government. It was all very Newtonian. So let's look at John Locke as well here. So again, the third in Jefferson's Trinity of Bacon, Newton, and Locke. Locke was one of the greatest figures. This is another article by Rob Nadelson. Was one of the greatest figures in English scholarship. His influence on the American founding was enormous, and it's hard to really talk about how much influence there was. So I am not going to do any justice to John Locke in this episode here, but I'm going to give a couple of highlights. We're not only just talking about the Constitution, but also the Declaration of Independence as well. Some have referred to Locke as a founding grandfather. His influence on founding-era political thought was based principally in two works: his Letter Concerning Toleration, which addressed freedom of religion. I wouldn't even say, I think freedom of religion is overstating Locke's view on this, but some Locke experts might debate me on that. It was really about tolerating Catholics, for example. And his second treatise on government, an examination of human rights and the origins of powers and government. And so rather than a mere toleration of religion, the Constitution actually, as supplemented by the First Amendment, took Locke's views further than Locke did himself, recognizing religion as a natural right, not just a condition to be tolerated. But his Letter Concerning Toleration was a foundation, kind of a springboard. And if you go through history, the way that ideas expand and can grow in the positive end, of course, they expand and grow on the negative end, you always have to look to some foundational principles. If you think about the ANCAP view of things, for those people who understand what that is, and the Rothbardian or Hoppian approach, you can look back to even Jefferson talking about law and government power that might be a precursor to a pure voluntarist or an anarcho-capitalist view as well today. But that's another side note. So he influenced separation of church and state, I guess we could call it. Now, here are some 6 main points. He had 6 main points of his political theory include this. This is a quick overview of John Locke's views. He said, God gives every person certain rights or power. So we don't have our rights by the nature of some document. We don't get them from charters, as Thomas Paine said. Dickinson said, our rights do not come from charters. They are just the recognition of pre-existing rights. We get them from our Creator, from God, from our birthright, just by being human. So God gives every person certain rights or powers. And Rob points out that in the 17th and 18th centuries, right and power were often used interchangeably. So a lot of times you hear people talk about states' rights. They're not talking about states having rights, like a right to keep and bear arms, because that's collectivism. What we're talking about is that the people have delegated a power. They have a right to act. Again, another side note. They were often used synonymously. And the people could have these certain rights or powers, which may be exercised at adulthood. Heads of families grant some of these rights and powers to government so it may protect those that are reserved. 3, government must exercise those rights or powers as a trustee, fairly and for the benefit of all. 4, as a rule, neither government nor individuals may infringe on the rights of others without their consent. This is, in essence, a non-aggression principle, kind of foundational view that you can do what you want to do as long as your actions don't infringe on the rights of another person to do what they want to do. It creates an interesting, again, Newtonian balance. But then again, number 5 is infringement does sometimes occur. This may be because of wrongdoing, a clash of individual rights, or the needs of government in performing its function. Of course, government will always claim it has needs, but that's another discussion. When infringement occurs, this is point number 6, those who benefit from the infringement must compensate the injured person for their loss. And those are really, I guess, a good overview of the 6 main principles of Lockean view of government, natural law, and rights. And he also actually Locke's writings influenced some constitutional sections here. And Rob writes that Locke's treatise contained many more specific observations, some which were realized in the Constitution. Here's just a few of them. The presidential veto complies with Locke's recommendation that the executive enjoy a small share, in the legislative power. Basically, the executive doesn't have the ability to create the law, but has the ability to say no to it. And it's a qualified veto, of course. The Fifth Amendment requires compensation when the federal government seizes property. And if you think about that in regards to one of those 6 principles, basically those who infringe basically have to compensate the injured person for their loss. We don't see that playing out the way that it should today. Hear from Dan Sanchez. So if you haven't followed Dan from Fee, he's definitely fallen ill, so we send him our well wishes, all of our thoughts and prayers, of course. So if you know Dan, you definitely want to reach out to him. I have not checked to see how he's been doing in the last couple of months, but he's done some great work, some great writing over the years, and some of the things that he contributed to our site under John Locke have just been awesome. Here's an article also which will be included in the show notes, John Locke's Case Against Absolute Rule. And Locke posited, Dan writes, that all individuals have rights to person and property, as well as the right to enforce those rights. So if you think about how Samuel Adams described the rights of the colonists in 1772, we have a right to life, to liberty, to property, along with the means to defend those rights in the best manner that we can. You can see how this part of the radical change in the viewpoints of the people which made up the American Revolution were heavily influenced by Locke as well. According to Locke, Rob writes, individuals have these rights because of their... this is Dan Sanchez. Sorry about that. According to Locke, individuals have these rights because of their human nature, not because of any government or social arrangement. And I covered another one of Dan's articles, John Locke on Tyranny, in another episode, which will be linked to in the show notes. And here's how Locke describes tyranny, defines it. Tyranny is the exercise of power beyond right, which nobody can have a right to. And this is making use of the power anyone has in his hands, not for the good of those who are under it, but for his own private, separate advantage. So tyranny, to John Locke, is the exercise of power not delegated. Exercise of power. So if government is only authorized to do those things that are delegated to in the Constitution, then an exercise of power beyond that is an act, as the founders called it, an act of usurpation, a theft of power from the sovereign people of the several states. St. George Tucker told us in his view of the Constitution in 1803 that usurpation is an act of treason against the sovereignty of the people. Jefferson in 1791 told us that a single step beyond the limits of the Constitution is to allow them a boundless field of power, recognizing that this is a tyrannical exercise. So if you think about living under the largest government in the world, largest government in history, which is the so-called federal government in Washington, D.C., and then, of course, all the vassal states that do all its bidding for it and does all kinds of terrible stuff through federal funding and federal programs and things like that, we certainly have a form of tyranny at every turn possible. It's the exercise of power beyond right. Hear from Dave Benner. This is a nice touch. Locke also argued that when all other political and individual methods of resisting tyranny are exhausted, only an appeal to heaven remains. This is in chapter 4 of his great second treatise of civil government. So if you think about tyranny, tyranny is an exercise of power beyond right. So those powers, those things that the governments do that go beyond the constitutions, either of the state or the Constitution for the United States, all of those are acts of tyranny, whether you like the results or not, because once you give them the power to do good, you also give somebody in the future the power to use that power for the exact opposite or for something completely different. Of course, they always look at power. This is, again, one of these maxims of human nature, that they always look at power as growing and growing and growing. What they have, the precedent, is always the floor, not the ceiling of what they'll do. So Benner writes, Locke explained that his reasoning was based upon an extension of his own natural rights theory. This is a long passage, but let me read this to you. And where the body of the people or any single man is deprived of their right, again, body of the people or any individual is deprived of their right, or is under the exercise of a power without right, which is tyranny, and have no appeal on earth, then they have a liberty to appeal to heaven whenever they judge the cause of sufficient moment. So again, it doesn't mean that at every turn it's like a war for independence. The person has to still determine that it's the right move, but certainly if we're talking about a foundational right to do something, this is the Lockean principle, which informed the Revolution, which informed the Declaration of Independence, which influenced the Constitution and the Articles of Confederation, and so much more. So where any single person is deprived of their rights, and if you think about the right to keep and bear arms, the right to free speech, the right against unreasonable searches and seizures, so many things where our rights, the right to travel, to go to work, I mean, we all have these natural rights. Whether the Constitution expressly protects them or not is another question, another debate, another discussion. But we can think of many examples where a single person or the body of people is deprived of their right under an exercise of power without right, so usurpation. And who else can they appeal to? If the entire system is against us, then all that's left is the appeal to heaven. They have the liberty to do that. And therefore, Locke writes, though the people cannot be judged so as to have, by the constitution of that society, any superior power to determine and give effective sentence in the case, yet they have, by a law antecedent and paramount to all positive laws of men, reserved that ultimate determination to themselves which belongs to all mankind, where there lies no appeal on earth to judge whether they have just cause to make their appeal to heaven. Again, alter or abolish is really what that gets down to. And if you think about the Declaration of Independence, some of the text is so very close. Here, this is a chapter 17, section 225 of Locke's two treatises. He uses this is the text. But if a long train of abuses, prevarications, and artifices, all tending the same way, make the design visible to the people, and they cannot but feel what they lie under, and see whither they are going, it is not to be wondered that they should then rouse themselves and endeavor to put the rule into such hands which may secure to them the ends for which government was at first erected. You could see, really, and if you've read the Declaration of Independence recently at all, you can see the parallels between this language and what Jefferson used. And of course, Jefferson, when he was talking about the Declaration of Independence, he specifically said he was not trying to come up with new ideas never before heard, but instead he wanted to put together the harmonizing sentiments of the day, an expression of the American mind, how the people, the revolutionaries, how they looked at things. And certainly he cited Locke and Cicero and Algernon Sidney and others as well. And we can see so much of the Lockean view there as well. And there's a nice paper here from Cleveland State Law Review from 1966. John Locke and the Declaration of Independence. It's pretty long and detailed, but we'll link to that in the show notes in case you want to take a look at that. Now, this is a kind of foundational information. We work hard every single day to get out to more and more people, and there is absolutely nothing that helps us do this work more than the financial faith and support of our members. You can join us for as little as $2 a month. I know they keep devaluing, depreciating the purchasing power of that fiat funny money, but if you got a couple of bucks of that dirty government fiat, please consider throwing it our way at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. There's also lifetime, annual, and 5-year options that you can choose as well. Again, I'm running a little bit late because of I should have restarted my machine before I got the show started because I saw some troubles happening, but hopefully I got some interesting information out to you. I hope you enjoyed the episode as much as I enjoyed putting this information together for you. I really appreciate you being here, and I hope to see you next time on the Path to Liberty.